Good afternoon. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Associate Director of Library and Museum Programming at the American Philosophical Society. Welcome to today's virtual discussion with Keith Beutler, author of George Washington's Hair, How Early Americans Remembered the Founders. This was the closest we could get in our programming calendar to President's Day, and we're so excited that so many of you have been able to join us today. Please let me begin by acknowledging that the American Philosophical Society resides in what is now known as Philadelphia, which is in Lenapehoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. In recognizing this, the Society expresses its thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of the Lenape, as well as that of numerous other Indigenous communities and individuals throughout this continent who have offered their guidance, their expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. Their generosity makes the work of the Society's Library and Museum possible. For those joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who've made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1.5 million in research grants a year, primarily to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. Please check out our website, amphilsoc.org, and we'll put that into the chat, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. Now, today's webinar is part of the Society's David Center for the American Revolution programming. The David Center is a collaboration between the David Library of the American Revolution and the APS, and is dedicated to supporting scholarship on the American Revolution. The David Library's founder, Saul Feinstone, believed that the examination of the Founding Fathers' values and the events of the Revolutionary period are essential to creating an informed citizenry able to comprehend and adapt those founding principles to the ever-evolving circumstances of American society. The center champions the active engagement of scholars, educators, and the general public of all ages, and a continuing and dynamic encounter with the most central episode in the creation of the American nation. A little housekeeping before I turn this over to Keith for his presentation today. We are using Zoom webinar for today's discussion, so not to worry, you have all been muted. We're going to use the Q&A function today, so if you have a question, you can ask it at any time. You might just want to locate the Q&A button on the bottom navigation bar. We're going to leave plenty of time at the end of Keith's presentation for question and answer. We're also very excited to offer closed captioning for today's virtual discussion. If you'd like to use it during the panel, please click on the CC box on the bottom navigation bar of Zoom. It's right to the right of the chat button. And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker. Keith Beutler teaches history and political science courses at Missouri Baptist University, including upper-level courses in his specialty, the United States Founding Era. And as I said, is the author of this brand new and fantastic book, George Washington's Hair, How Early Americans Remembered Their Founders, published by the University of Virginia Press. And as a special thanks for everyone who has tuned in today, we have a generous discount, which we will be posting into the chat. So if you haven't gotten your copy, please go to the UVA website, use the discount, and start reading. So let me stop talking and turn it over to you, Keith.
Thank you so much, Kyle. It is good to be here. And I'm going to begin, not surprisingly, by walking you through some of the books. So if we could bring up the first slide. I'm going to begin by talking with you about Charles Willson Peale, who of course is very familiar to fans of the APS, since he had strong affiliations with this organization. And this is, of course, Peale's famous self-portrait, The Artist in His Gallery, The Artist in His Museum. And Peale is, as you probably know, is important for a number of reasons in early American history. First of all, he began, as you are seeing it here, the first museum dedicated to American history. And he started this in the Long Gallery, as I think it's still known, at Independence Hall on the second floor of that building. And he had pretty impressive skills as a artisan. He was a brilliant painter, and also he was a taxidermist. And both of those interests of his come together in this painting. So if you look at it, what you're really seeing, among other things, is Peele's view of memory being implicitly worked into his museum. Now, let me tell you a little bit about what that view of memory is. And in fact, that is the topic of my book. I wrote the book because I wanted to understand two things: the memory of the American Revolution founding, or we could say early American patriotic memory culture. And I wanted to understand that memory. The second thing is historically. I wanted to try to understand it as much as possible in the terms in which people in the period, and I looked primarily at 1790 to 1840, thought about memory itself. And in fact, I discovered a number of things in doing the research. First of all, people wrote a lot more about memory in the period than I had initially suspected. There are reams of essays that people wrote at the time, books about the nature of memory, and of course, instructive manuals about mnemonics, about how to, as a practical matter, remember things. And one of the things that I discovered is that people in the period are going to tack increasingly in a physicalist direction, is what I would call it, in their view of memory. Now, one of the best ways to understand this is with reference to a trope that many Americans themselves referred to when thinking about how memory works. They were, many of them, familiar with the ancient Greek story of Simonides of Chios, who, so goes the story, was in a banquet hall, and as he was enjoying the banquet, the bad news is that the roof collapsed and it killed most of the people in the banquet. Simonides was one of the sole survivors. Later, when officials were trying to determine, the death count and bury the victims of this, Simonides was asked to try to help them, and he was able to identify the victims by where they were sitting underneath the roof when it collapsed. And he was able to know that because he thought back to where he was sitting and then thought to the person of who the person was next to him, and then thought of who the person was next to them, and so on and so forth. And the lesson that people drew for hundreds of years in the Western tradition from that story was, the way they would put it, is that memory has to be localized. Now, there are still shades of this often in popular teaching about mnemonics today. So you're probably familiar with, tricks that memory experts try to teach to students, or maybe even to professors, to help us remember things, where they might say, for example, imagine a building, a room, a house, or whatever, and put in mind's eye in that house, furnish the rooms in an order that you find evocative, with objects that remind you of the things you want to remember. And then when you want to remember them, you just sort of take a mental tour of the house. This is sometimes, again, referred to as the memory palace idea. Now, the thing about this is that in the Western world, from Greco-Roman times to certainly the era of the early American Republic, people's view of how that should work became a very influential trope, but their view about whether the rooms had to be literal, material in the real world, instantiated in that way, or whether they could just be in the mind's eye, they tacked back and forth between those two competing views or visions, between a literal physicalist take that said you have to have sensate interaction in the real world with things that remind you of what you want to remember, and a more abstract, we could perhaps say, Platonic, Plato evoking view that said that it could just be a sort of metaphysical sense in your mind. Importantly, for the period that I'm looking at in the book, what I show from scads of essays and books in the era is that the memory culture moved almost militantly in between 1790 and 1840 in a physicalist direction. Now, there are a lot of reasons why this happened. Perhaps the key reason is because you have in that era a burgeoning dedication, a very self-conscious dedication to science. People are thrilled with the new science, with what the scientific revolution, which is fairly mature by that point, has brought into the world. And they want, certainly the intelligentsia especially, wants to do things wherever possible in a scientific way, to the point that sometimes they scientize things. They wrap it in the gilding of science, whether or not what they're doing is per se scientific or not. And so it was with memory, that people are increasingly going to say that memory must be based on empirical interactions in a sort of Cartesian relationship to the world. More simply, a slogan that was sometimes used at the time is that memory leans on the material world. Peale absolutely was enamored of that idea. And you can see it in this museum that he constructed in the Long Gallery at Independence Hall. If you look there at the image, if you look to the cubicles that ring the room there, as you may know, those are animals that Peale, being not only an artist but a taxidermist, has taxidermically preserved. And very pointedly, almost all of them are animals that are indigenous to North America. And the reason that he has populated, his museum with those displays is because what he's really doing is trying to create a sort of great chain of being with those animals in a Linnaean classification, moving from, so to speak, simpler animals to more complex and in most cases, literally larger animals, although not in every case, in any case, more complex, up toward the images that you see at the very top ringing the room. And those are portraits of human beings, and not just any human beings, but primarily, almost exclusively, they are portraits of leaders of the American Revolution. Looking straight on at the image, if you look in the far upper left, you will see actually one of those images, one of those faces of someone as the curtain is being pulled away right near the apex of that. And that is George Washington. And beneath George Washington, you can see there a bald eagle, right? So Peale is communicating that North America, scientifically observed, represents a great chain of being with animals of increasing sophistication and evocation, very much both, and with the founding fathers, Homo sapiens, being the best of the best of human beings. And he's very self-consciously, I mean, he writes fairly prolifically about this, trying to rebut scientists in Europe who are arguing otherwise. So famously, the French philosopher Buffon in this period was arguing that there were things wrong with the American environment, that it was inadequate physically, and that it was producing diminutives, both diminutive animals and diminutive people, inferior people and animals. Peale sees his museum as a rational, indeed, he certainly believes, scientific rebuttal of that. And he is also creating then a memory palace. This is his version, you might say, of the house with the rooms that evoke things with these cubicles. And he is very clear about all of that. Now, just to give you a sense of how serious he is about this and how scientific he takes himself to be on it all, one of Peale's great laments, one of his great regrets that he discussed late in his life was that he had not done as he had wanted to do, and that is approach Ben Franklin, his friend, and ask Franklin to allow him to taxidermy Franklin's body itself upon Franklin's death. Peale had actually done this to Franklin's pet rabbit. And as he thought about it, he thought probably Franklin, being a man of science, would go for this. And so he thought, it might work, that Franklin might accept it. But he never worked up the courage to broach it to Franklin. And again, he lamented after Franklin died that he hadn't, because he further hoped that had he managed to convince Franklin to let him taxidermically preserve Franklin's body, he hoped to use the cachet that Franklin had with the other founders to persuade the others to allow him to do likewise. And so he wanted to create a gallery of American worthies, as it were, that would reinforce with the sensate props his whole argument that America is not an inferior environment, scientifically considered, and that American history, culminating most recently in the revolution and the founding, and in the literal bodies of the founders, refuted any such view that Buffon and others might be floating, for example, in Europe. If you look at the bottom right of the image, you're seeing there a part of the jaw of a mastodon. And as you probably know, Peale actually unearthed a mastodon skeleton. And this too is part of his argument. He's literally trying to draw attention to that, to say, I mean, look how big this one portion of the mastodon is. Again, he's arguing, if you look with real scientific eyes, you will see that the American environment not only doesn't produce diminutives, it produces massive creatures like that. And then on the bottom left, we see the turkey. Now, I don't recall that Peale ever said anything all that florid about why he chose to put a turkey in that image. But I think I get the general idea. As you may know, Ben Franklin at one point wanted the turkey to be the American bird. And I think it's in that vein that Peale is saying that, you know, we have these pretty large, even our birds can be quite large, not diminutive at all. If you look deep into the painting, you see several people walking around, including fairly prominently there, a woman. And I think what Peale is conveying here is the fact that he sought to make this memory palace available to all sorts of people in America. He wanted all different classes to come to the museum. And so he very purposefully kept the cover charge for entry quite low. We don't see here any images of the visitors, but in fact, Peale, as you may know, had this device that he invented that he called the physionotrace. And that was used when people visited the museum for a very small fee. They could pay, and many then did, to have their silhouette traced. And that silhouette would be traced onto double paper that would then be cut out, and Peale would keep the top layer of the paper. He would archive the images of all these people who came through his museum, people of all different classes and backgrounds and different genders. And then the people themselves would take away, in each case, a cutout also of their own image. And Peale liked to sit up at night and look through his collection of these profiles and organize them according to where, simply looking at people's silhouettes, he thought those people belonged in the great chain of being. And he wrote that he hoped that, in general, when people visited his museum and saw this great chain of being with the elite, you know, founders at the top, and Peale himself had been in the revolution, was somewhat in that company, he hoped that people would know their place, literally that they would, or as he also put it, that they would know their dependence on their superiors. And so this is a very class-oriented, elite view of memory. And Peale here is resisting, notably, the more egalitarian views of, for example, his friend Thomas Jefferson. And he's trying to promote an old organic view of society with some people as the head and other people, you know, more as the toes, much further down. And he also wrote that he hoped that with the physionotrace, that as people got these images of themselves and took them home, that as they mentally remembered from this memory palace what the founders looked like, how amazing they were compared to themselves, that they would put themselves in place and fall in line, in essence. So again, he has this very conservative view of memory. And that is the one that, to a large extent, is going to prevail in American culture into the 1820s. A couple last things that are very important about Peale. Peale, the reason he called this device that he used to trace out people's images, the reason he called it a physionotrace is because his whole enterprise here was really based on his belief in physiognomy, which, as you may know, in the 18th century was most famously promoted by the Swiss clergyman Johann Caspar Lavater, who said that by synecdoche, by looking at parts, one could infer wholes. That by this process applied to the human body, one could read people's character out of small physical characteristics of a given person. And one of the things that Peale specifically said is that this was true of hair. Indeed, I'm sorry, not Peale, but Lavater said that. And Peale believed it. Peale bought into Lavater's view. Lavater said that from the hair alone, we may know the man. And Peale, really accepts this. And so he believes that every detail in his paintings of the founders, including their hair, actually reveals their intrinsic, scientific, innate character. He's going to pass that imperative on to his children. And as you've probably heard, his son Rembrandt Peale in particular begins to see himself as the keeper of the memory of George Washington. And he paints what he calls the standard likeness of Washington. And Rembrandt Peale actually boasts specifically that he, in researching the painting, was able to look at Washington's hair before it was powdered. And he actually, says that this high degree of accuracy, including even just the detail of Washington's hair, is one of the things that allows Washington's character to be read out from the painting. Now, Rembrandt Peale is really functioning, most in the 1820s and 30s, and especially then as you get into the 30s, alongside of physiognomy, you get sort of a subset of physiognomy, which is the phrenology craze that you're probably familiar with. I have rather a bumpy head myself, and as you may know, the phrenologists in the 1830s and going forward in the 19th century thought that you could read people's character by synecdoche by looking at the protuberances on their head. And they had a growing, somewhat proto-scientific view of the division of the brain into sectors, but they overread, the evidence. And so they thought they could map people's character by simply looking at the shapes of their skulls. And Rembrandt, being of that era in the 1830s, is going to specifically say that his painting allows people to do that with George Washington and the other founders. And one finds in the 1830s a lot of phrenologists trying to flatter American audiences, I think is one way to look at it, by arguing that we now have scientific proof through phrenology that the top founders are truly top people, not just in political power, but in their essence, that they are superiors. Let's go to the next slide, if we could, which looks at the historical societies. And the historical societies that spring up during essentially this same period, the first being founded, of course, the Massachusetts Historical Society by Jeremy Belknap and friends in Boston in this era. The historical societies, rather like Peale's museum, are going to be very aware of the new memory theory that tries to localize things and emphasizes objects of memory. And they are going to, similarly to Peale as well, promote, for the most part, a pretty elitist view of the memory of the American Revolution. And so, Peale begins in the 1790s promoting that elitist view. The historical societies, more or less, pick up in that vein. And we see a number of them founded over the next 30 to 40 years. This particular individual we see in the center of this picture is John Fanning Watson. And he was a banker by day in Philadelphia, but also, as you probably know, being in Philadelphia, I'm sure you've heard of Watson, probably his Annals of Philadelphia, a wonderfully energetic chronicle of tidbits that he collected about the history of Philadelphia. John Fanning Watson was as well a founding father, although not officially, but he was certainly, for example, eulogized as such. In fact, he was eulogized as the founding father, which I think is an exaggeration, but he was a founding father de facto of the Pennsylvania Historical Society. And if you look at this image, you find out things not just about John Fanning Watson in this collage here that I put together for you, but you'll see here features of these early conservative historical societies. If you look on the left of the image, you are seeing there John Fanning Watson's memory box, which is really a micro memory palace, a cabinet of curiosities, if you will. And as you probably know, the historical societies, the early historical societies, including the Pennsylvania Historical Society, had these cabinets of curiosity that were essentially organized according to the principles of local memory. And they juxtaposed, as you can see that John Fanning Watson does here in this collection that he puts into his memory box or his cabinet of curiosities, they juxtaposed texts and relics of history and treated texts themselves as relics, as props, physical props in this new physicalist view of memory, and used them to promote their own, again, mostly conservative, take on the American Revolution. John Fanning Watson, when he published that book that has been reprinted even today, that you can find certainly all over the place in Philadelphia, when he published the Annals of Philadelphia, he deposited extra illustrated manuscript editions in the Pennsylvania Historical Society and the Library Company of Philadelphia. And in the published rendition, he included a table such that it said, if you go to one of these institutions, if you go to, for example, the Pennsylvania Historical Society, and you turn to page 72, he would give you a specific page, you will see there in that extra illustrated edition that I've deposited with them, these relics. So if you look at the right-hand side of this image, on the bottom right, if you follow the key in the published edition, you would turn to this page in the, this one I think is in the Library Company of Philadelphia, still is. And the system still works. If you turn to the page that he tells you to, he tells you, you're going to see on the bottom right a swath of black cloth. And he says that is taken from a coat that belonged to Benjamin Franklin. And so he literally uses his text to guide you into another text, a master text on deposit that has actual physical relics. And Watson, like Peale, is just incredibly clear about how all of this relates to Simonides, to memory palaces, and to this new science of memory that emphasizes, claims a proven need to lean on material artifacts. Let's go then, if we may, to the next slide. And just when we think we know where the vectors of American memory culture then in the era are going, it turns out that there is a sort of unintended, well, certainly unintended, but a complication, if you will, that I don't think anyone in the era foresaw, and the fix wasn't in, but that incidentally, yet significantly, reshaped by its implications the memory of the American Revolution, and in fact, democratized it for the most part de facto. And that is what I would call the demography of death. And this chart that you're looking at, the way I generated this is I took two sample cohorts of officers randomly chosen of all ranks who survived the American Revolution but served in it, veterans of the Revolution, and an equally sized cohort of privates who survived the Revolution. Now, already we want to mention a couple of caveats. Of course, in real life, there were more privates, more enlisted men in the Revolution on the American side, or for that matter, the British side, than there were officers. But even if you set them, as I do here, as same-sized cohorts initially of veterans who survived the Revolution, you get over time, as you can see so dramatically on this chart, a sort of scissors effect. So that as you move, say, toward 1840, it's a multiplier. What's going on here, this divergence that you're seeing that gets wider for the most part as we move along, is owing to a couple of things, some of which you might intuit. The fact that officers tended to be older than enlisted men, that enlisted men, therefore being younger, tended to live longer after the American Revolution. The fact, of course, that there are more more enlisted men by quite a bit than officers ends up interacting or intersecting with this other prior fact that the officers tend to be older and the enlisted men younger, such that by the time you get to 1840 and you're down to, say, in most villages, if you look at the census of 1840, it actually gives us Revolutionary War pensioners in communities. And extrapolating from that, of course, not everyone who served got a pension, but looking at that data and looking at data like this, you can infer, and my best read of it is that the odds are about 20-1 in your average, small village, face-to-face community in America, that if you encounter a veteran of the Revolution, that person is going to be a private. That person is going to be a former enlisted man. That person is not going to be an officer. And if they are, it's probably very, very low ranked. Now, why is that important? Well, when I was a kid in the 1970s, I went through this stage where I was reading about World War II a lot. And only in retrospect did I look back, years later, perhaps not until the 1990s, and realize that almost all the books I read as a kid in the 1970s about World War II treated the war as if it was waged and won exclusively by the officer corps. And even at that level, that it was, waged and won by 5-star generals for the most part, and maybe Patton in there, with his 4 stars at some point. And the enlisted men barely even appeared in those accounts. And if they did, it was just tangentially. They were just, in the aggregate, these armies that the officers moved around virtually at will, seemingly like pieces on a risk, game board. Then later, when I was off to graduate school in the late 1990s, you get another phenomenon. You get Tom Brokaw writing his book, The Greatest Generation, and you get HBO's Band of Brothers. And what has happened is that by the 1990s, very few officers, the officers having been both older and fewer from World War II, are still alive. And nearly all of the living links, the statues in human flesh, as people referred to veterans of the American Revolution by the 1820s in the United States, saying the last living objects of that memory instantiated in human form are almost all privates. So in the 1990s, if we wanted to talk to someone by the 1990s who was in World War II, who fought in World War II, we were almost inevitably going to talk to someone who had been an enlisted person. And all of a sudden, those people were discovered as sources for World War II. And something very similar happened in the United States in the 1820s and 30s with respect to the memory of the American Revolution. As George Bancroft said at the time, all of a sudden, average veterans were being carted about until their bones were ready to fall, off of them. And they were suddenly celebrated as living links, as material props in this age that emphasized the need for material props of memory. They were emphasized as the last leaves on the tree materially of the American Revolution. And they were thrust onto the stage of performative patriotism. Go with me, if you would, to the next slide. And in this next slide, we're looking at my favorite example of this, because it turns out that this demographic change, as it intersected in the way I've just noted with changing memory theory, with the tacking of memory theory in a physicalist direction, created unforeseen but very significant opportunities that average veterans now begin to seize. And they're able then to find their place in the public square in a way that many of them had not even anticipated. And this is my favorite example. This guy that you're seeing down in the bottom right is Ahmed. He was a Black Revolutionary War veteran. He had been a drummer in the American Revolution, and he drew this wonderful, I think, self-portrait of himself, sitting comfortably in a rocking chair, enjoying a smoke with his, long hair. And he is going to make his way in the world in the 1820s and 30s by his self-identification as a veteran of the American Revolution. And also, he claimed as a friend and acquaintance, both really, of George Washington. In fact, Ahmed claimed that at some point he had been enslaved by the Washingtons, but nonetheless had been, beloved by George and Martha, and that the family had given him these artifacts that you see here on the screen as well, these locks of George Washington's hair. These are two portions that survive in separate museums today of Ahmed's cache of what he said was George Washington's hair. And I won't belabor the story here, but for the longest time, I thought, and I didn't blame Ahmed for doing what I thought he did, but I thought he was, I thought he had good reasons maybe to do this, as he was living by his wits, in the time period. But I thought that these weren't real. These weren't, the genuine article. I still can't prove that they were, but it turns out that Ahmed actually did have a friendship in Middletown, Connecticut, with a young man who went to a military school there. And if you look in the center left of the image, you see this map that I've put as the background to this whole slide. And you can see this burial ground there up near the road. Yes. And in the southwest corner of that is where Ahmed's house is. And, I use the map just as a backdrop, so you're not seeing the whole thing. But if you were to imagine the area where Ahmed's sitting, obstructing the map here, that was where this military academy was. And an heir of the Washington clan lived there for a time, as Ahmed lived in this little house. You can actually see the house if you look very closely there on burial ground in the southwest corner of that. And that family, I can show you, had, from the evidence, had locks of Washington's hair. So it's actually possible that Ahmed was given some of the real stuff here. In any case, it's just remarkable that he did this, because what he's really doing is, if you look at the details of his biography, is he's taking a stand for himself. And he's taking a stand for his dual identity as American and African. You can see his hair there very prominently. And Ahmed made waves in Middletown, Connecticut by wearing his hair in what people thought was a flamboyant fashion. He wouldn't cut it. He would wear it in a style that people said was African. And from the evidence, the things that people said about him and his relationships with people, I think it's clear that he was in effect betraying what W. Du Bois so much later, he was demonstrating the two-ness of that many African Americans felt and perhaps feel, of both an African identity and an American identity. And Ahmed, importantly, was proud of both aspects. He was not ashamed of either. So he represents himself as someone who fought in the revolution, who is himself a founding father, and as someone who, is every bit as entitled to shamelessly represent himself ethnically and otherwise as anyone else. And in fact, there was a colonization society located not far, had its headquarters not far, its meeting place, from his house there. And, they were trying to send people of African descent, quote unquote, back to Africa, all this racism. And Washington's hair itself, not particularly in Middletown, Connecticut, but locks of Washington's hair were actually used by people in the period, in particular, most famously, a guy by the name of Peter Errol Brown, and his locks of Washington's hair, his samples still exist. The Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, to try to argue that Washington's hair, by its scientific characteristics, Brown said particularly by its tensile strength, that it demonstrates the physical superiority not just of Washington, but Brown, being very racist, argued that it was evidence, when contrasted with the hair of people of African descent, for the superiority of Caucasians. This was crazy circular reasoning, pseudoscientific, not properly scientific at all, as all scientific racism in the period was really just pseudoscientific. But Brown's research, citing Washington's hair as evidence for the superiority of Caucasians, appears here and there and is cited in American scientific journals on into the early 1930s. Ahmed is a living refutation of that kind of synecdoche. We could talk more about him and his hair. You might have some questions about that. I promise we're not just reading into it. He made much of his own hair and its Africanness. Let's go to the next slide, if we may. And this is an image of Emma Willard, who founded a school for girls in New York. And Willard, as I talk about in great detail in the book, was beyond versed in the new memory theory. And she argued that this physicalist view of memory was a scientific breakthrough. She correctly argued that she was an expert on the new views of memory, and she worked them into her pedagogical methods. And these are a bunch of her students years on in the 1890s, who these women in their old age banded together to rear a statue to Emma Willard, not just to thank her for what a great teacher she was of American history, and particularly that of the founding, and she was all of that, but also to thank her in a way that was consistent with her physicalist view of memory by creating this physical object, this statue that would permanently instantiate her memory. And to the right, what you're seeing there is a scrapbook that one of her students kept that today is held in a museum in Chicago that includes locks of George and Martha Washington's hair, because Emma Willard had seen locks of hair, as many people conversant in the new memory theory did, as particularly efficacious props of people that we might want to remember historically. And Willard, and other women too, but Willard is a true champion in this regard. Willard indeed petitions the New York legislature on this basis. Willard is going to argue that if you think of the new science of memory and how it emphasizes physical intake of memories, and then realize that women, as they become mothers, are, and this was certainly true in the culture at the time, are disproportionately physically proximate, physically in the presence of their children, particularly during years of nurturance, that it then falls, indeed must fall by the new science, disproportionately to women to physically inculcate important memories, including those of the American Revolution. And so, Willard will insist, women, no less than men, girls, no less than boys, must be educated completely, in depth, fully, in the memory of natal American memory and Central American principles that we wish to conserve and preserve and push on. And she and others pointed to, during this period, to George Washington's mother, Mary Ball Washington, and not coincidentally, consistent with the new memory theory, there was a huge push in the 1830s that eventually succeeded over time. It wasn't all done in that era, but a push to build a statue of Mary Ball Washington. And Willard and others said, Mary Ball Washington, we believe, because this is the only way memory is inculcated, was physically present to young George and materially taught him in a hands-on way the most important principles of the country. And so all women must be conversant in those. Well, that was a rather involved introduction, I suppose, but let's take some questions now, if we may.
Great, thanks so much, Keith. That was fantastic. So we are at, we've got about 15 minutes for questions. And I invite you to use the Q&A function, which is on the bottom of your screen. I would like to start. Keith does not know this is coming, which makes, that's why we all tune in for APS events.
Oh, wow.
So I don't know, Keith, if you're a fan of the Antiques Roadshow, the way that I am. And, so I went into our museum storeroom, which has many, many treasures.
Yes.
Folks, I want you to know at home, this is completely unscripted. We did not practice this in advance. And I pulled out this. So I know there's a glare, which is going to be sort of hard to read, but let me read the, there's some hair.
Yes.
And then there's a label. And this label says, Hair of Washington, presented to me by Mr. Vaughn, who received it from old Mr. Peary, the barber and hairdresser of Washington. And I can tell you this came from the David Library's collection and came to APS in 2019 when their collection
right when they merged.
So when you see this, and we're going to put up on the screen, you've been very humble, and you haven't shared your great website yet, georgewashingtonhair.org, which we're going to put up the link for. Sure. So I wonder, when you see something like this, what is all of your research what does it tell you about this particular? Is this kind of exemplary of what you've found, or is there something?
No, that's in some ways, surprisingly typical. Although my immediate reaction, and I don't evaluate things for auction houses or anything like that, but this appears to have decent provenance and believable, at least, right? I mean, at first blush, as I'm looking at here on a Zoom screen, some things look right. I guess basically about it. Certainly, the story has plausibility with Pierre, the barber, and so forth. I mean, I would give it a close look. But it's interesting because I thought you were going to show me a lock of Washington's hair, putative lock, that was given by William Lanier Washington, because I actually thought that was the only one the APS had, and I thought that had come through the David Library, and I thought that was the only one they had. Obviously, I was wrong about all of this. And my shortest, algorithm for detecting like high-level frauds, this is my personal opinion, is William Lanier Washington. I wouldn't trust that guy with anything. I mean, you may know the stories. He just sold absurd amounts of supposed reliquary, to support himself. But that looks believable. And if you do go to georgewashingtonshair.com or org, redirects to .org automatically, I have a map there in the upper right where I show more than 100 institutions in the United States today that have putative locks of Washington's hair. And I stick there only to institutions. I don't out private collectors. Some of those people have paid a lot for their purported locks. Recently, a Google executive paid thousands of dollars to buy a pretty well provenanced lock of Washington's hair. And again, the provenance is better in some cases, certainly, than in other cases. That one looks fairly decent to me. I think, if you want to see the mother lode, maybe you would go to Mount Vernon, right? Because they have 60 putative locks, and I've literally read through all of those accession records, and they would be the first to say, some of those, they themselves doubt are the real deal. But the major story here is how many do seem to check out. In more cases than I ever imagined, you can see the correspondence coming and going, within the larger Washington, his set of heirs, the family. And the people to whom they gave these things, they really gave them out in some cases early on as almost like political patronage, in certain instances, in the years after his death, particularly. And it's a remarkable thing. So on my map, I show 116 is my current count, institutions in the United States, and there are a couple in Europe, in France, and in Britain too, but almost all in the United States, that have such an artifact. And I'm mostly surprised by how believable the provenance often is. Put it that way. My favorite example in terms of provenance is the one in Boston that the Masons have, because as you probably know, they wrote a letter directly to Martha shortly after Washington's death, requested a lock. Martha concurred, and Paul Revere himself made the urn, purpose made for this, in which they keep the hair to this day. It's amazing. It's amazing.
So you didn't talk as much about the sort of maybe religious dimension.
Yeah, I'm glad. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to skip over that. All right.
Well, I wonder if you'd be open to it, because I think
I am.
Our story of religious devotion, especially in Protestant North America, is not one that seems like it should be too interested in the corporeal, right?
That's right. No, you're absolutely right. And obviously, Protestants, famously liked to distinguish themselves from Catholics by saying that they didn't venerate relics of saints, which Protestants said, was idolatrous. And during much of the period I'm looking at, while there are, of course, Catholics in the United States, including some who'd been involved in the Revolution, Charles Carroll of Carrollton comes to mind, for the most part, the culture is fairly militantly Protestant. And this actually did pose a problem for American Protestants who are so dominant culturally, who wanted to and did, for the most part, join in this fray to grab hold, to take history by the hair, in many cases literally here. And sorry about that. And you can edit that out of the video version if you want. But they are going to, in many cases, and I deal with this at chapter length, they're going to point to the science of memory as ballast that explains, how they can still do this, because they're going to say they're doing science, they're not doing idolatrous veneration. But, does that distinction make a difference? It often does not look like it's making a difference in terms of the emotional connection. And in fact, I think this is remarkable, but I found 3 Catholic commentators in print during this period specifically call Protestants out on the craze for Washington's hair and say, this is amazing. You won't allow us to venerate the bones of Peter, but you can call it anything you want. That's exactly what you do with locks of Washington's hair.
Well, I think that leads to another sort of question, which when we start to think about maybe that's that gray area, right? Yes. Especially within evangelical practice.
Yes.
I imagine you probably had a chance to go to the Methodist archives at Drew, perhaps at one point in your career, and seen Whitfield's thumb that is there.
Exactly.
So there's a great question here from Arnie Patel about other people's hair. And so Arnie asked specifically about other presidents' hair.
Yeah.
But is Washington anomalous, or
is
this a larger trend?
It's a both and, right? So as the question suggests, it's not pure singularity. There are other people whose hair gets collected, and of course, people do this within families, just as mementos of affection. And yet, on the other hand, the scale with which this is done in Washington's case, with reference to him, as opposed to other people, there's just no comparison. I mean, even globally, the only individual I know who might be a counter to this is, I've read a bit about how many relics there are of the Buddha, and I don't know that scene really well. They may exceed the number for Washington, but other than that, perhaps even on a global scale, I just don't think anyone, the detritus that was handed down was quite as much. And I think that is very revealing in terms of the place that he held in the American imagination and the way they tried to make it more than imagination to try to keep it concrete in that way. To the questioner's wonderful point to the texture of that fellow I mentioned, Peter Errol Brown, who tried to develop scientific calculi proving scientific racism from Washington's hair, he collected the hair of every US president from Washington through Buchanan. Brown himself died in 1860, so he didn't get Abraham Lincoln's hair. But if you go to the Academy of Natural Sciences, they can show you Brown's presidential hair book, and you can go page by page, and he has a lithograph of each president and then a lock of their hair. And the amazing thing is the correspondence is pristine. He kept the records of to whom he wrote in these families. You can check it out on the other side, and it's the real deal. He collected also, Charles Wilson Peel's hair, other elites, but he also collected the hair of insane asylum inmates and people of different races and animals. And this is where it gets disgusting. It was all to feed into his preconceived matrix to show the superiority of Washington et al. Over, people of other races and classes.
It's reminding me of one of the objects that was in our previous exhibition, Dr. Franklin, Citizen Scientist. And there was a point when Franklin was overseas, and he asked his wife, Deborah, to go and actually collect some hair samples of African-American youth.
Yes.
And it's an object that, as educators, it's a difficult thing. What I appreciate very much about your presentation today is it maybe helps us put it into a little more context, but that, it's certainly not a positive story that they are a positive outcome. It feels like
right
by that practice.
Absolutely, it is quite the cautionary tale about how blurry for individuals in their own time the line can be between science and scientism. Right. Between looking at facts and cooking them, basically. Yeah.
Right. Some great questions that are coming in here. I'll try to get to as many as I can. So Frank Ferreira asks, why did collecting locks of George Washington's hair eventually decline in popularity? And I guess I should ask, has it declined in popularity?
Yeah, that's the thing. I don't really know. I suppose if you think that people are properly careful about the provenance, then it's a finite supply, right? On the other hand, it's pretty divisible supply. You can take hair and cut it into smaller sections, even in individual hair. Is it in decline? I don't know. I mean, it depends how you parse this. There is a surprisingly thriving market. And I may be, at least one of the only people in the world who gets a daily Google report on new mentions of the phrase Washington's hair on the internet. And I can tell you that, every few weeks, some auction house, again, sometimes the provenance is better than at other times, sells a lock of Washington's hair. There's not surprisingly clustered around his birthday a couple of days ago. There were a couple of these things. So there's still a market, and some people are spending thousands on it.
This is not meant as an endorsement. There is an auction actually going on right now that if you type in George Washington's hair.
There is.
The last time I think something was sold, or one that was sold recently, went for $35,000.
Wow, yeah, that's
a lot of money for follicles.
Yeah, it is.
So there's a great question here. Now, is this a sort of post-death phenomenon, or is there documentation that Washington himself was giving away his hair?
That's a great question. He did start giving it away before he died, and the first time we know of him doing it is actually when he's on post at Valley Forge, and he sends a lock of his hair to an admirer, and this is a young woman who. You can read between the lines, but there seemed to be some flirtation between her, Kitty Livingston, and Alexander Hamilton, his aide. So it almost looks like Hamilton sort of set this up, maybe with a little bit of a, humor involved. You can almost read that out, but Washington sends her a lock of his hair, and you can see that going on to a limited extent in other cases while he's alive, but it explodes after his death. That's a hinge point, right? Not just for his family and for his image, but for American culture. I mean, it's almost like a nuclear strike, when he dies in 1799. I mean, people are going to write for years later where they were when they heard the news, that he had died. Yes. And
there are multiple questions in here. I think this is probably a question you're anticipating. DNA has.
Oh my, yes. I've talked to a lot of people about this. I'm not often quoted in the New York Times, but I was in 2018. There was a story where they quoted me on something, and so I started getting a lot of email, for a few days. And there was actually a researcher, I think at Cornell. I'd have to look up who he is, but he told me that thus far I was right. That at the moment you can't really get DNA because you don't get the whole follicle, usually, and that's what you need to get. But he said that he's working on a process where he thinks in a few years they'll be able to infer a lot of the DNA sequence from the other portion, the shaft of hair. But there are a lot of questions as to whether we'll fully ever sequence George Washington's DNA, and then of course all the wild questions of could we clone him? Should we? I'm against all that. I think it's quite missing the point. But who knows? Somebody might pull it off someday. I can't say that's not my area.
Right. So there won't be a sequel in the works.
Yeah, right. I'm working right now on Thomas Jefferson's toenails. That's actually the next project. But I am thinking about that.
We hope you will come back to the APS when you have the definitive work on that. Thank you, Keith, so much. What our audience doesn't know is that you had a bit of a sore throat today. You can't tell it at all.
Very much so. Yes.
You have been fantastic. Please, everyone, take advantage of the discount code. This is a fantastic book. Go out and order it. Keith, please don't be a stranger to the APS. Now that the COVID numbers are going down, if you're in the Philadelphia area, we'd love to have you here in person.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Great. Take care.
All right, you too. Bye.